Hello, and welcome to the Ocean News Podcast, an audio series taking you through the breaking news and the biggest stories from the oceanographic newsroom. I'm Rob Hutchins, editor here at Oceanographic Magazine, and in this episode, I'll be diving into an ocean of mystery and intrigue, the kind that has mystified sailors and ocean explorers across the centuries, and a phenomenon so profound that it has woven its way into folklore across some 400 years of history. Yes, today we are exploring the phenomenon known as Milky Seas. The first official documentation of a Milky Sea dates way back to the 1600s, when sailors first recorded a phenomenon in which swathes of the open ocean before them would turn a brilliant, luminous white that stretched for miles. Over the centuries, records continue to crop up, each describing this extensive cover of bioluminescence as a thing of both beauty and wonder, but also, for the superstitious sailor, something ominous, ethereal, and ultimately inexplicable. Given the sporadic nature of their occurrences and the documentation over those centuries, the truth behind Milky Seas is something that even today eludes researchers. But it's with thanks to Colorado State University's Hudson and Steven Miller, a doctoral student in atmospheric science and professor at the university respectively, researchers can now make important strides towards better understanding them, what they are, and what causes them, by compiling 400 years of documentation to create the world's first and only global database on Milky Seas. In a special extended-length episode this week, both Justin and Stephen join me on the Ocean News Podcast to dive on into the mystery. Justin, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me on the Ocean News Podcast. And yes, it'd be great to start off just by, at the very start, actually, and just if you could talk us through the study, the level of research that's gone into this, because what a collaborative effort. And what you've landed on now.
Yeah, Justin's the one who's been digging through all the boxes and going through all these anecdotal encounters and records, and he'll be able to tell you all about that adventure. Before that, and I think, before even I was looking at this, there was another person, Peter Herring, University of Reading, I believe, who is I would consider kind of the father of Milky Seas, if there is such a thing, in terms of somebody who's actually gathered all that information at one time historically, and tried to kind of make the first cut of what's going on with these. And Justin's, taken this to the next level. But the Milky Sea work, I mean, this, like we were saying, from folklore to fact, scientific knowledge, this is an ongoing quest, and this is one of these things where, like the mermaids or the stories of the Loch Ness monster or something like that, it's really very much started that way. It's like these tales from the high seas, and then over time we've learned that, through encounters and into modern day, that these fantastic glowing oceans, where anywhere you look around you is just widespread glow, steady glow, like a snowfield, does in fact happen in nature. This isn't some tall tale from the high seas. And so at this point, we're just trying to learn more about them. We have our hypotheses of what's going on. We have even very limited measurements, but what we really need at this point are the very detailed measurements that can get us the answers. So, one of those things is to do that, we need to understand Milky Seas, where they form, when they form, historically up to modern day. And this is where Justin comes in with his research. It's really priming us to answer those questions.
Yeah. So Steve had mentioned Peter Herring, and Peter Herring, he, back in 1993, him and his then grad student, Maggie Watson, put together their own database of Milky Seas. And they were sort of continuing this long line of people who, like, every 30 or 40 odd years from 1810 onwards, put together a database of Milky Seas, hoping to find an answer to, like, what is actually going on out in the middle of the ocean. And due to some weird, I guess, accidents of history, almost basically everyone's database they put together has just been lost over the years. They would put out a publication or write something or send a letter to someone about everything they collected, but the records that they gathered themselves usually ended up just being lost, including Peter Herring's compiled database.
Really?
Yeah, it's just this thing of where, because it'd be every 30 years someone learns about Milky Seas, becomes interested in it, does the groundwork, but then nothing happens because they were kind of hit this wall of, we have all these eyewitness accounts, but until we can actually go out to a Milky Sea and study it, we can't really progress. So then sort of the scientific thread just dies, and with it, sort of interest and then sort of knowledge, and it kind of gets revived again 30 years later. And we were fortunate enough that Peter Herring is still around, and he kept his sort of personal records from the time period he put together his database. We were able to sort of largely reconstruct his database and then sort of add on to it, almost doubling it in size to create our new database.
So, and that's grown that to what size are we talking now then, this database? It's
415 observations are in the paper. And then as soon as we published the paper, as the middle as I was going through, we actually saw a new Milky Sea on satellite. So we're actually a little higher than that now. So the paper is actually already technically out of date.
The satellites are really what kind of kicked us back into gear on the Milky Seas. I think it had sort of started to become forgotten again in the late 90s and early 2000s. That Peter Herring's papers came out in the early 90s. And then it was very quiet in terms of anybody talking about it anymore. And I should say that this came about, this topic for us came about from just some spitballing ideas about what this future, at the time, the future low light satellite sensor might be able to do, that previous generation sensors that can detect things like reflected moonlight and city lights were understood to be able to do. So we had this new sensor coming that we thought would be, the next best thing. And one of the big kind of white whales, if you will, things that we were after was bioluminescence from space, bioluminescence seen from satellites in the ocean. The Navy, the U.S. Navy and various navies were always interested in this back in the 80s because they would leave tracks behind their ships and the submarines would be showing themselves at night. And this was strategically very bad to do. So there was studies back in the 80s on bioluminescence, the traditional kind, the stirring of the waters that makes something flash transiently. And those sorts of bioluminescence were always understood to be too transient, too weak in terms of not filling up a whole satellite pixel. It was so small that, it just kind of washes away the signal. And so we never were able to see any kind of bioluminescence from the satellites. Even the earlier generation low light sensors never saw anything. But with this new one coming, it was like, okay, maybe this new one can do something the others couldn't. And at the time, we were like thinking, oh, maybe we can go after these ship tracks now or something like that, or the breaking waves along the shore during red tides to make the flash. But I just kind of naively Googled the question, are there any forms of bioluminescence out there that are widespread, such that they would cover many, many satellite pixels? Are there any bioluminescence that are steady in their glow and don't just flash and go away, such that a satellite that's coming over might have a better chance of spotting it? Expecting the answer to be no, and instead coming across some really obscure Science Curiosities website from William Corliss. It was like Scientific Frontiers or something like that. And in it was a little excerpt from a report from a ship that had been off the coast of Somalia. It's a British merchant vessel. And they, reported seeing what looked like an aurora borealis on the horizon. And as they approached, they saw this demarcation in the water from normal dark waters of the night. It was like 8:30 or 9 p.m. And they went right into these bright, glowing waters that were steady and all the way to the horizon. And after several hours, they were still in it. And by then, it was all around them in every direction. And so this is how we kind of got turned on to the idea of looking for Milky Seas from space. Now, for Justin's database, it starts out with these very colorful, reports.
Yeah, the earliest one is from the early 1600s. It was like the fifth or sixth British East India Company voyage.
Wow. I'd love it if are you able to sort of recount how that was described?
Yeah, I can actually pull up the account real quick for you. Are you ready? We fell in the night into a white water like an extreme shoal, but had no ground at 60 fathom line. The latitude about 10 and a half. And that's actually a very consistent description over the centuries, that they think that it reminds them of being sort of like a shoal environment, and they're like very worried they're going to run aground, so they quickly throw their fathom line overboard and get very confused.
Yeah.
They're actually deep out in the middle of the ocean, and it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's like more of them too. That's like Justin, you had those two from Kingman and from the Alabama. Do you mind if I read the Alabama one? It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So this is from the logs of Captain Raphael Semmes, actually, from the CSS Alabama. This was a Confederate warship that was out on the high seas during the American Civil War in 1864. And basically, they were doing a form of piracy where they were trying to keep supplies from coming from, Europe over to supply in the North. So they were, raiding these boats. But for whatever reason, they were out in the Northwest Indian Ocean at this time looking for their the ships. And they came across something. And so from his logs, he says, at about 8 p.m., there being no moon, but the sky being clear and the stars shining brightly, we suddenly passed from the deep blue water in which we had been sailing into a patch of water so white that it startled me, so much that it appeared like a shoal. The patch was extensive. We were several hours running through it, and around the horizon there was a subdued glare or flush, as though there were a distant illumination going on, whilst overhead there was a lurid, dark sky in which the stars paled. The whole face of nature seemed changed, and with but little stretch of the imagination, the Alabama might have been conceived to be a phantom ship, lighted up by the sickly and unearthly glare of a phantom sea, and gliding on under the pale stars one knew not whither.
Just wow. I mean, it's the way that the poetic way that that it's been described, it gives it such this ethereal nature, right? You can see why this has become a folklore that's passed across all these decades and it's just fascinating hearing those accounts. No wonder you guys were so switched on to this subject. You're sort of presented with accounts like that and across the centuries and then you can give it this modern day sort of is it well, it's not an explanation yet, is it? Because I read that there's only one sample's been taken in all this time, right?
Yes, and it was completely by accident. They just happened to be on an unrelated research expedition and just happened to pass through one. So they collected a sample of water and did their best to test it, despite not being prepared to do so.
So with that sample, though, it gave us our first indication that, yes, these are not dinoflagellates, which are the ones that flash, but they're more likely these luminous bacteria, which upon growing to a certain concentration will be able to detect each other in the water and begin emitting a steady glow, which is the key here, the steadiness of the glow that we see. However, we don't understand really what conspires to create these blooms when and where they happen, because there's definitely life in the ocean all over the world. There's big blooms of algae all over the world, and yet only in certain key spots, which Justin highlights in his paper, do we see these Milky Seas being prolific.
Wow. Yeah, it's incredible. And these hotspots, what's the most prevalent? Is it the Somalia around there? Yeah.
Yeah, the coast of Somalia, and then near this island called Socotra, which is owned by Yemen.
I see. And is there a hypothesis as to what may be going on as to why these regions in particular are where you're seeing the most occurrence?
Well, so our main thought with this is basically so that specific region is connected to several large scale atmosphere ocean phenomena that sort of are very good at supercharging life in the surface layer of the ocean,
Mm.
creating large blooms of algae and with it associated like expansion of the bacterial population, such as like the Indian monsoon or what's called the Indian Ocean dipole, as well as El Nino / La Nina. But even though this region is so primed with upwelling biological activity, there are other regions around the world that are just as like biologically prolific. So there actually is also a question of why specifically that part of the Indian Ocean versus other areas that have comparable levels of upwelling and large-scale phenomena driving biology in the ocean there, what makes sort of the Northwest Indian Ocean so special, is also a big question, though.
Yeah, Justin, you might also mention that in addition to the Northwest Indian Ocean, there is one other major hotspot.
Yeah, so there's sort of Northwest Indian Ocean is about 60% of all known Milky Sea occurrences, and then rounding out about 20% is an area that we atmospheric scientists like to call the maritime continent, which is sort of Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, sort of all of those island countries north of Australia.
This is a region where in 2019 we spotted from space the largest Milky Sea that we've documented from satellite so far. And this one was spanned over 100,000 square kilometers of surface area of the water. So imagine the size of Iceland.
God.
So, yeah, and this one lasted for many weeks. When they get that big and get going, the conditions are such that they can last for a long time. The thing is, they're like way out there on the high seas most of the time, tend to form in areas where there can be strong winds nearby, and then associated with that, rougher waters and stronger currents. The Milky Seas themselves tend to happen in these quiescent zones in between all of this maelstrom of wind and currents. And we have some reasons to think that that might be a key as well in forming these natural barriers in the water that prevent mixing and keep a body of water kind of quiet and undilute, such that these special conditions can set up and create a Milky Sea. And this might be a key to why they don't happen everywhere. For example, there's a really cool excerpt from Captain Kingman. Do you have it, Justin?
Yeah, do you want me to read it?
Go for it. Yeah.
This one is, I think, it's one of my favorites because he is so, I guess, caught up in the moment of seeing it that he compares it to the biblical apocalypse. This is from Captain Kingman of the Shooting Star in 1854. The whole appearance of the ocean was like a plain covered with snow. There was scarce a cloud in the heavens, yet the sky appeared as black as if a storm was raging. The scene was one of awful grandeur, the sea having turned to phosphorus and the heavens being hung in blackness, and the stars going out seemed to indicate that all nature was preparing for that last grand conflagration, which we are taught to believe is to annihilate this material world.
Just so lyrical. It feels very special being privileged to hear those accounts.
Well, there are more modern accounts where you have like experienced captains saying, they saw it for the first time and it will be it's the most like fascinating, memorable thing they've ever seen out on the ocean in their decades of traveling.
Even the one in Java that was in 2019, the 100,000 square kilometer one, this one was so big and so bright that we, from the vantage point of space, there were certain parts of the feature where you could see what looked like little dark pock marks on top of the bright feature, which was over night after night, it was just swirling and moving off to the west. But those little pock marks turned out to be clouds that were blocking the light coming up from the water. Put that in your mind and take yourself down to those waters, which some people have described as looking like molten lead. They're so bright, and looking up at the sky, and the sky is reflecting some of that, light back, and it's making the stars appear like they're going away. But then imagine some clouds around that are now being underlit, like a swimming pool light coming up and underlighting the clouds. And that just must be quite amazing to see, like a field of clouds that are their bases are all bright and their tops are all darker. Complete opposite to what you would see during the day, right? Where the tops of the clouds are reflecting the sunlight and the bottoms are dark.
Yeah. But Steve, when you give it that description, I can now draw a very strong parallel to those biblical sort of apocalyptic scenes. You can sort of understand where that dramatic sort of interpretation comes from.
Yeah, or the first people who may have witnessed the total solar eclipse. They stand up on their knees and pray for your life or pray for whatever.
Yeah.
A small yacht actually went through that Milky Sea in 2019. We were able to match that up on the boundaries of their entry and exit, just like the previous British merchant vessel, the Lima. And what they ended up doing, which seems to be a common response to anybody who goes into a Milky Sea across history, at least when there were toilets on board, they'd run to the toilets and flush the toilets because the water going through the toilet starts to glow, and they just like really like to see that. The other thing that they do is they take a bucket, which is usually for swabbing the deck, and they'll dunk it into the water and bring up, the bucket and try to figure out what's going on in the water. Curiosity, what's going on here? And a lot of times they don't see anything. And in this case, when they brought the water up to the surface, it was mostly just dark water, but there were little specks in the water that were glowing steadily. Not flashing, just floating around. You imagine the little specks floating and drifting around the water. They stuck their hand in and swirled the water, thinking, okay, now it's going to start to glow like normal. It did the opposite. Those little specks actually turned off and got dark. So the water became more dark upon the stirring.
Yeah.
Then after the water got settled for a while, the dots came back. So this is a totally flip-flop process, which is also, by the way, consistent with a bacterial type response.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Really interesting. So one question is, what are the chances that you guys then will be out there in a Milky Sea observing it from the deck of a ship?
Go for it, Justin.
Well, so this, I guess I sometimes like jokingly describe the whole goal of my like doctoral work is to actually get Steve on a boat so he can see it himself.
Yeah, Justin's been like, his paper is like the start for our new push to do exactly this. And Justin's actually kind of written up some preliminary methods for forecasting when and where Milky Seas might happen, and giving us some lead time on that. You want to talk about that, Justin?
Yeah. So we've been mainly focused on sort of an area within the maritime continent just south of the island of Java. This is this is like a very historically prolific region for Milky Seas, but it has the nice added quirk that they're very irregular in their timing. You can go several years without ever seeing one there, both on the satellite imagery and the eyewitness accounts. And that quirk means that there's probably some sort of large scale forcing that varies over years that is probably affecting when they occur. And we can kind of, from the location, tease out that it's probably tied to what's called the Indian Ocean dipole, which is this sort of this pattern in sea surface temperatures in the Indian Ocean, where you'll have the Southeast Indian Ocean be warm or cold, anomalously warm and anomalously cold.
Yeah.
And the Western Equatorial Indian Ocean will be the opposite. If that is anomalously warm over there, it'll be anomalously cold near Java, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And this phenomenon is connected to El Nino / La Nina, and it also modifies and modulates all of the various monsoons of this region. So it's sort of, they're all interwoven together. And so we've been kind of focused on sort of how can we use that interconnected nature of the Earth system between all of these phenomena there to find the correct sort of conditions for all of these phenomena at the same time to produce a Milky Sea. And we've be able to see that if even basically you don't even need a complicated model, you can actually just very easily start seeing that these phenomena, if you put them together in the right way, tell you when a Milky Sea is going to happen.
Fantastic, which obviously gives people a chance to get there and conduct deeper research and wrap their heads around the phenomenon.
That's sort of like it's like a huge step is to be able to get someone out there at the right time. Because if you don't know when a Milky Sea is going to happen and you spend all of this time and money and resources to get a crew out there to study it and it doesn't happen, you're going to have a really hard time convincing anyone in the future to ever give you a shot to try it again. So really being able to nail down when and where they're going to happen is like the most critical step towards being able to reliably sample a Milky Sea and sort of finally solve this centuries-old mystery.
Yeah, so we're kind of building on that. We're sort of right now in the stages of setting up these de facto SWAT teams, if you will, where we are making connections with local groups who live in these areas where it's a quick shot out into the waters. Like, for example, speaking with a couple groups in Java right now, there's a governmental research agency called BRIN that's based in Jakarta, and they have a lot of microbial ecologists and marine scientists there, and they're super interested in this phenomenon. It's funny talking to the experts in this field and realizing that not even they know much about this phenomenon, and they're really intrigued by it. We're making connections. We've actually made some on the southern shore, some connections on the southern shore of Java with fishermen some of which who have actually seen Milky Seas in their past. Also a group out in Mogadishu, City University of Mogadishu in Somalia, and then another group out in Bali, in fact, as well. So we're packaging right now these little kits, which contain something like, a couple flasks or small test tubes, some syringes to draw water, some preservatives to keep the water, in its state when they collected it, with the hopes that, with Justin's, growing abilities to forecast when and where in a regional maybe a seasonal and regional sense where they might happen, we can prime, these groups to say, okay, be on the lookout, be ready. And we're going to be watching from space with our satellites to see if something's going to pop up or not. They'll be ready and ready to go from their location to get out there and take the samples that we need.
When you say that the goal is to get you out on a boat, is that because there's some? Are you wary of the water?
I would love to dive into a Milky Sea and just dive down and swim and see how deep the glow went, because that's like one of these big questions right now. Where exactly in the column is the glow? Is it right at the surface? Is it a depth? Is it a volumetric thing? And the answer to that question is really important in terms of saying how many bacteria are involved here, which is, we're talking about almost a mole of bacteria in some cases, like 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd number of organisms, which is an incredible number to think about. Even a modest sized Milky Sea, like the one that the Lima saw back in 1995, that one was about 15,000 square kilometers of glowing ocean, which is about the size of Connecticut. Based on our calculations, that Milky Sea contained more bacteria than what was understood to be the total population of free living bacteria in the world's oceans along the coast. So it's from just one little event, it had that many bacteria involved. And it was like, wow, how could something that massive, happen in that localized area? This is more bacteria than we thought were in the world's ocean, period.
Blimey, yeah.
So you think about that, and then you think about, okay, what are the role of bacteria in nature, right? They live to break things down. Their role is to biodegrade. And something that a lot of folks don't understand about bacteria in the ocean ecosystem is they're at the very bottom of the food chain for sure. And you might think that they might be, not so important because they're so tiny. But when they can get together and en masse like this and create an expression that we can see from space, that means that their populations can get huge, and quite literally, they can get huge overnight in response to something going on in the water. There's something called the microbial carbon pump, which is a description of how the balance of carbon in our atmosphere, which we know we're adding to and creating global warming right now, there's a balance between what's in the atmosphere and what's in the ocean. It's a chemical balance. And carbon is brought in from the atmosphere, taken out of the atmosphere and into the ocean through organisms like bacteria, like algae, and microbes such as bacteria will actually use that carbon. They'll take that in, and when they eventually die, they can take that carbon down to the bottom of the ocean through what's called a refractory carbon process. And it's no longer going to go back in the atmosphere again. It sinks down to the ocean floor. It can turn into limestone, and over time turn into rock and be taken out of the carbon cycle. So it's a really important question to ask ourselves. What's going on with Milky Seas? What are they telling us? If bacteria can bloom at these scales, they might play a more significant role than we thought in terms of the air-sea carbon exchange and their role in this microbial carbon pump. So Milky Seas are an indicator that we don't yet fully understand the coupling that's happening between the atmosphere, the ocean, and the biosphere. This is what we call Earth system modeling, where everything's connected together. Us as humans, we're part of the biosphere as well. we happen to be carbon producing creatures, but these bacteria are carbon sequestering creatures.
Mm.
And if Milky Seas can pop up like this, it's telling us something about the Earth biosphere response that we didn't know about before, and maybe we should know a little bit more about in the future.
Yeah, and I guess continuing off of what Steve said, we don't actually know what Milky Seas mean for the ecosystems they happen in. They could be a sign of an extremely healthy ecosystem. They could be a sign of an extremely distressed ecosystem, or they could just be a very neutral sign. But either way, it is about as big of a big, giant, glowing of a sign as you can probably get in nature about something. And the regions where Milky Seas happen the most are also regions where fishing is a major part of the economy for those people who live there. And if Milky Seas are some important ecological indicator, then they're also a very important sort of social and economic indicator for sort of like people's livelihoods and their food.
Well, what a deeply fascinating subject. And I feel that you've not only shone a light on the subject for me, you've completely illuminated for everyone listening as to why it's so important that we continue to chase down the mysteries of the ocean. Thank you so much both for your time and your expertise. To learn more about this story or other stories on the wide unknowns of the ocean, head to the Oceanographic Newsroom. This has been the Ocean News Podcast. I've been Rob Hutchins. Thank you for listening.